and then you can share your screen. There's a share screen at the bottom, share screen icon.
All right, let's see if I can get the right tab up and running on this one. You guys seeing my slides?
Yes.
Awesome. Seems like
right,
we are in business.
Yep. So all right, I'm gonna come off, go on mute and stop the video, or stop my video rather. But yeah, take it away. Introduce yourself. Thank you to the people who have joined so far. Ashley and Monica. More may attend. Who knows? But yeah, take it away.
Sounds good. Awesome. Well, good to meet and those of us who are on the call. Let's see if I can get the next slide going for us. I am Allie Cappitelli. As you probably heard us talking a little bit, I live in the St. Petersburg, Florida area where it is endless summer all the time. Love the area a lot. I have been in marketing technologies for over 10 years now, and about half that time has been as a consultant. So a lot of really cool experience and a lot of breadth in a number of tools and areas. I threw my LinkedIn and Twitter on there. If you want to connect with me, I'm always happy to make new connections, get to know people in the community, and just be a support for everybody. Currently, I work at a company called Maxio, and we do financial software and financial services. So I work with those guys. If you don't have it, I included a link to the Pardot certification guide. Really, it's called Account Engagement now, just to make sure everybody has the naming correct here on out. Account Engagement Certification Guide for the Consultant exam. What we will cover today is automating business processes. So kind of the bread and butter of a marketing automation tool is automating. So we will dig into a number of great features, and that covers about 17% of the exam roughly. So they list out three main things: given a scenario, recommend automation tools to solve those challenges. Also design a sequence of events in Pardot to complete a marketing initiative, and then finally develop and implement a lead nurturing strategy. So as an outline for today's session, I wanted to dig into the four main automations within Pardot that are covered within this particular part of the exam. We'll go into each one: automation rules, segmentation rules, dynamic lists, and completion actions. Then we'll dig into some of the advanced filtering and settings in those areas. Finally, we'll put everything together, when to use each automation, and then we'll put it all together with a scenario of how to approach different projects and some helpful ways of thinking about it. One thing I included on slides is these little key icons, and those are helpful markers with links and things that you should take a look at and be familiar with as a general best practice as a consultant, but also just as prepping for the exam. It's really good to know a lot of this information. So put those as keys on the slides that you'll see throughout the presentation. So without further ado, let's talk about our four automation tools. So as I mentioned before, Pardot has a lot of great automation features, and we're going to cover four of them today. There is one that we're not going to dig into, which is engagement studio programs. That's for a different session, which I'm pretty sure they have recorded already. So take a look at that if you haven't seen it already. But we will cover automation rules, segmentation rules, dynamic lists, and completion actions. So tool number one, automation rules. These are awesome, to say the least. They are super powerful, very dynamic, and you can do a lot with them. And Salesforce really has expanded what you can do with it, and it pretty much is kind of like the tool, one tool to rule them all, so to speak. And it allows for users to perform actions based on a set of criteria. So automation rules, you're automating actions. The really cool thing with them is once you turn it on, it runs in the background. So it continues to do its job over and over again, while you continue doing other things like building emails and whatever. So a set it and forget it example, a real world example for us is we have a free trial form that's available for people. So I've worked at companies where they offer this free trial, but they only offer it to certain regions. So if it's available in a certain region, when someone fills out the form in a country outside of that region, previously we had someone reach out to each one of those contacts individually and say, hey, we appreciate your interest, but the free trial isn't available in that region. What we were able to do with Pardot is we were able to automate that. So we created an automation rule that looked for people who had completed a free trial form, but who were maybe outside of that geography, and sent them a message saying, hey, here are your next steps for that. So we took the manual work out of it by putting it into an automation rule for our sales team. And that gave them the ability to not spend time sending emails and not screening each free trial that came in. They could focus on the ones that were qualified right out of the gate. So quick little set it and forget it example for you. There are two main components of an automation rule. So the first is the set of rules that evaluate what a prospect is. So you set up all these criteria, and then you trigger the second thing, actions. These are the things you do to a prospect once you've identified that they qualify. So we'll dig into these more. Your rules are criteria to query the database for. It can evaluate things like a default or custom field value. You can look at Salesforce campaign membership, things like they filled out a form, are they on a different list, and even their email status. So a lot of great flexibility in terms of filtering your database and really honing in on the prospects you want to take action on. And if you look at the bottom here, you'll see our first key. This is a link to all of the available rule options for an automation rule. So Salesforce has a great article that lists out all of the different criteria that you can leverage for an automation rule. So take a look and be familiar at what you can do with those. Once we've got our list of prospects we want to do things with, we will put our actions together. And these are things we do. So they can be internal, meaning not end user facing, like updating a default or custom field, maybe adding them to a Salesforce campaign. You could send an alert to someone internally. So all of those internal actions, but there's also an external action here where we can send an email to a prospect as well. So we could send them an email, like in the example I discussed earlier. We can send them an email to let them know, hey, maybe this isn't a great fit for you right now. Or another example for an automation rule, you could have an automation rule that sends people a birthday email every single year. So send them an email, wish them a happy birthday, maybe give them an offer or something. I know there's a lot of great companies out there nowadays who trigger out free things for people's birthdays. You can take advantage of that and do an automation rule for that kind of action. So internal system kind of default things, and then external actions as well. And then there is a link to all the available actions for an automation rule as well. So here is a look at what an automation rule is. And you can see you can add multiple criteria on an automation rule. Each line item is customizable. You can even leverage the concept of groups and match settings for more robust filtering. So you're not limited to just say the form was submitted and the country is United States and they're not a member of this list. You can use your match any criteria and kind of change how things are. We'll get into some of these match criteria and rule groupings later and how those play together. But for now, just know that this is what it looks like within your account engagement or Pardot account, and you can add and remove as necessary. So here's a complex logic example where we're showing a match any or a match all at the top, and then we actually have a match any rule group in the middle, showing you that we are saying they filled out the form, any form or any form handler, and a custom field value is 0 days in the future. So we are looking to see that they filled out a form or form handler today. That's what this is actually saying right then and there. And Ben, I don't know if you had a question or anything, but I do hear you off mute.
Yeah, so I wanted to, something that I've been trying to call out when people have been doing the presentations is the thing about the consultant exam is that it's situation driven, it's scenario based. And so when thinking about the kinds of material that people might see, the kind of question types that people may ask or may get asked on the exam, like a scenario would be like an example of a scenario would be that would involve an automation rule would be you're given a business problem that is that is, let's say, about like an event or something, or some kind of route, some kind of lead routing, some kind of something that has to be continually running based on very specific criteria. Between an automation rule and, let's say, an engagement studio, why would you use an automation rule? What is the benefit of using an automation rule, and what are the drawbacks of using an automation rule? And the automation rules are great, but they're very powerful, and so powerful that Pardot actually sends you emails and says, hey, do you want to use this? Because this has been running for 30 days and nothing's happened. Because nobody wants to be the one that forgets about an automation rule that was out there, that was built a year ago and is still running. And then suddenly you have an event and you upload a bunch of people that happen to meet the criteria of this automation rule, and a bunch of things happen to them, a bunch of actions get taken that you did not intend to happen for the specific use case, the specific event that you're uploading for. So I just want to caution people that automation rules are great, but they are limited in the number that you can have, the number of automation rules, that active automation rules that you can be running, and they will send you emails saying, do you want to have this still running? Automation rules can do a lot. They can do a lot of heavy lifting, but they should also be kind of deployed around specific scenarios and situations. And when it's done serving that scenario or that situation, they should be disabled. So I just wanted to kind of reinforce that automation rules can solve complex business problems. It can move data around. It can, and it can take batch actions. However, it's a hammer and nail situation where there is no, like, once the criteria is selected, you can batch a bunch of actions together, add to campaign, notify user, add to list, add tag, all happen at the same time. But you're not able to do you're not able to do criteria on the actions, where it says, do this, but don't do this if this is true. But if that's true, do this instead. It's very much like, once everything matches, everything just runs. So if you're needing a scenario-based or some kind of criteria-based actions that can take actions of kind of similar to an automation rule, that's a scenario where you'd want to use an engagement studio. So I just wanted to call that out, because those are the kind of things that you could get on the exam, where they're going to ask you for a scenario. They're going to give you a scenario, and they're going to ask you which makes more sense. Why would you use an automation rule over an engagement studio, and so on.
Yeah, that's super helpful to clarify a lot of that, because it is true that there are scenarios where it may seem that, an automation rule may be the best option, but when you really dig into what's being asked of you, an automation rule isn't right. So the conditional actions that you're describing is a great example for an engagement studio program. Like Ben was saying, the second that you turn on an automation rule, it will run all of the actions on every prospect it matches. That's great if you know exactly who you want to trigger the actions on, but you need to be very careful with leaving something like that on in the background. Kind of a worst case scenario I've seen in a client org over my time is someone had a repeating automation rule, which means it was allowing people to go through every single day. But what happened was they hadn't run any kind of testing to make sure that someone only ran through when they qualified to run through, meaning that there was a qualifying change. So they were literally sending 30,000 prospects through an automation rule every single day, and they didn't need to. So it was just essentially running 30,000 people through an automation rule every day for no reason, which was eating into the database and just making all these updates that really didn't need to happen. So just being very targeted with when and why you use something, and then turning it off if you're done with it, is a really good point. So one thing that's helpful in thinking about a consultant exam too is that you want to slow down and really think about what they're asking you, because scenario-based questions, it's really easy to think first thought, best thought, but there are often key pieces of information that you miss if you just run with your first thought. So I encourage people to read the entire question and really seek to understand what they're trying to ask you to do, and then start solutioning into what tool within Pardot best matches what they're asking of me. What are they describing as limitations? What kinds of options are available? And then really go through the pros and cons of each to narrow down what the right option is for you. So hopefully that helps. But thank you, Ben. Appreciate the context there. A couple things that I hit on already, but automation rules hit an individual prospect only once by default. You can turn on this concept of a repeating rule, which means people can go through it every single day, or as frequent as you define. So this screenshot here at the bottom is a checkbox that you can turn on with an automation rule. You can set the number of days that it takes for someone to be able to repeat a rule. And then you can even go down to say there are no unlimited, or there are no limits to how many times they can run through a rule, or you can say they can only go through it X amount of times. So if you do turn on the repeating portion of it, make sure you're thinking through why you must do that, or what is the scenario that you would need it to repeat. Going back to the birthday example, that could be a really good one to look at a repeating rule that would allow people to run through once every 365 days. So it would be a 365-day number that you would put in that days for eligible to repeat rule area. And one thing to highlight, a rule is created in a paused state. You have to activate it for it to be on and running in the database. So just because you hit create doesn't mean it's turned on. There have been examples of that where I've worked in orgs and someone thought that a rule was on and it was not. So that is a phase that you need to go through when creating an automation rule, is turning it on and making sure it's active before you assume it's doing data. So went a little quick there. All right, segmentation rules. So a segmentation rule is versatile, but a little less so. I think it is a great tool to use for very specific cases. They are, in a sense, the little brother of the automation rule. It is allowing users to perform a limited set of actions based on criteria. And it runs one time, period. And that's it. It does not continue running in the background. It is a one-time segmentation with actions running on eligible prospects, and that stops after that. So it is a great use for the name segmentation. If you're looking to segment your database, this is the right action potentially for you to use. So like an automation rule, you have all these criteria available to you. Very similar options available here as they're available with an automation rule. However, actions are different on this one. The actions related to a segmentation rule are related to lists, adding or removing to a list, adding or removing from a Salesforce campaign, and adding or removing tags. So when you're thinking about a scenario to use a segmentation rule, you're thinking about very specific scenarios where you need to take a really granular group of people and do something to them one time. An example of that would be if you run an event and you get a bunch of leads from a booth and you want to put them all into a Salesforce campaign. A segmentation rule would be a great way of doing that. You can batch everyone through that one time, add them to your Salesforce campaign, and that takes care of that action. So thinking about the difference between this and an automation rule is a great tool for constantly running in the background in your database and querying databases and doing things repeatable or automatically. A segmentation rule is a great one-time action to move people around the database in either a list, campaign, or tag. And that's a really key point to remember, is segmentation rules only have 3 kinds of actions related to campaigns, lists, and tags. So if you remember that, that's going to help clue you in on an exam to whether or not a segmentation rule could be an option to a question. If they're asking in a scenario-based question to send an email, a segmentation rule cannot send an email. So that's helpful to keep thinking through, is what kind of actions are available to me, and that will help narrow down any kind of options that you're facing in the future. So campaigns, lists, tags, if you keep those in mind, you'll be good to go with a segmentation rule.
Yeah, I have a kind of a use case that I encountered recently. I was reached out to because someone said that their client needed to add everyone who was part of a list, they wanted to add them to a campaign with a status of sent. Now that's not standard use case, and I would typically argue against it, but they were just asking me how that would be achieved. So and when you're going through the email sending process, you have three automations you can trigger when you're sending it, for an open, for a click, and for a unsubscribe. Those are the three, but there is not an option for on sending ad. And this is for list email, not an engagement studio. So when you're doing this for a list email, there really isn't because you can't do it as a table action. I tried. It's not available as a table action. So the only option that is available is to run a segmentation rule, where you basically take whatever the list is that you're planning to use to send, and just run it once and say, okay, everybody on this list, add them to the CRM campaign with the status of sent. It's really kind of manual and kind of stupid, but that's really as far as I can tell, that's the quickest and cleanest way to do it when you're not using an engagement studio. And when you just need to be able to add people to a campaign that you're going to send an email to, that you want to add them as a campaign member with sent, is you would run a segmentation rule on that list.
I think that's a great example, because it's not like it needs to run continuously in the background. Yeah. It's a list email. It's a one-time thing that you do, and you're done. So
yeah,
I think that's a really good example.
It's a single batch action.
Yep. One action, one run, that's it.
And you can rerun it, but you have to click you can rerun a segmentation rule. We have to manually go in and click the rerun.
Yeah. It won't automatically query the database like an automation rule will.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Awesome point. I love all these examples you have too, Ben. So keep throwing them in. They're great.
Okay.
Here's just a screenshot for anybody who's not familiar or would like to have a visual. I'm a visual learner, so I appreciate screenshots. So basically this one is saying that this person's a member of a test list, and we're going to add them to this campaign with a specific status. So that is exactly what Ben just described too, is, hey, we want to take this list of people that we're emailing and then go ahead and add them to a campaign. So real world example here. So wanted to give you guys screenshots. Looks like Monica loves screenshots too. So I love it. Somebody else gets me. Dynamic lists. All right. So let's move on to our list bucket. So account engagement lists are buckets for storing prospects. That's the easiest way I've thought to explain it. There are two types. For those unfamiliar, static lists are just a group of prospects. You have to create automation or import to the list to add or remove people. It's not automatically updating. It's a bucket that just kind of sits there on its own, doesn't really do anything on its own. The dynamic list leverages criteria to automatically add and remove people to the list as they match the criteria or unmatch the criteria. It is constantly updating in the system as changes are happening to your database. So really powerful tool for you. It has filtering criteria, just like an automation rule, just like a segmentation rule, except that's where you stop. So there are no actions off of a dynamic list. It is just a list where you're putting all these criteria together, and then all of the data ends up in the list. So you have a big list of prospects. There is also an article here for all the options available for list criteria. The consistent theme between all of them, the dynamic lists, segmentation rules, and automation rules, is the criteria tend to be very similar. I don't think there's really any differences that I can think of off the top of my head between the criteria. It's all about the action side of it. So no actions on a dynamic list, just building that list of people. An example that I use is we have a suppression list here at Maxio that removes people from our mailable emails if they have received too many emails within a time period. So you can make these time periods whatever you would like, but we have set up 3 times in the last 7 days. So if someone gets more than that, they end up on our suppression list and they don't get another email until they come off of that dynamic list. This just prevents email fatigue. It makes sure that we're not sending too many emails. And it's a little bit of accountability for us in the marketing team to make sure that we're not oversending to people. So if that list there gets too big, it's kind of a clue to us to maybe slow down on some of the things or get more targeted with the emails that we are sending out. Job titles is another frequent one that we use. And then also competitors. You can create a dynamic list that has criteria for all your competitor email domains and websites and try and remove your competitors from email marketing. So a couple of good examples there to leverage a dynamic list. Ben, any thoughts before we jump to the next area?
Yeah, the dynamic list, the other dynamic list that I tend to recommend is, I tend to recommend, I guess it depends on what you're doing, but if you're trying to look for if you're trying to build a dynamic list to make sure that specific groups don't get an email, I typically will do employees. So anybody who's got an email address or company name, because I mean, I'm going to tell you that you will, when you're testing your own stuff, you'll put your email address in there, you'll put variations of your email address in there, but you're typically probably going to use the same domain, the same at Maxio or at whatever. So basically like trying to catch as many of those. And then also your partners and vendors. If you have vendors and partners in there who are testing stuff, you don't want to send emails to them because that's not useful. So just making sure you have a list of your vendors who could potentially be prospects in the system. And then so employees, vendors, partners, competitors, that's typically going to be important. There's so much stuff that you can do with dynamic lists now that where you can set what you have your prospects have been emailed at least 3 times in the last 7 days. You can mix and match. You can use dynamic lists if you're trying to, one of the things I've suggested with clients that I'm doing kind of database cleanses for. I'll look for people who have whose created date is in the last 90 days and last opened email date is in the last and has opened at least and has been sent emailed at least 3 times in the last 90 days and has not opened an email in the last 90 days. So it's meant to kind of give you this subset of your database that's newish in the last 90 days, but has been an emailed at least X number of times that has not opened any of them. So they could potentially be they could potentially be not good for marketing, or they could be good for a reactivation campaign if you want to try and retry them. So you can also use that for if you want to make sure to not include anybody who's part of an opportunity, in case people are in the sales cycle, and saying they're not engaged, but they're part of an open opportunity. Those people could be good for a reactivation campaign, or you want to make sure not to suppress them because you may need to do some outreach for sales for this or that reason. Being able leveraging all the Salesforce functionality available to you in terms of ownership, if they're a member of a queue, if they're a member of a specific opportunity, all these different things will help you be able to slice and dice your audience to build very tactical, very, very kind of bespoke lists that will allow you to send very specific messages to a very specific subset of your audience.
I think one thing that's really helpful, a pro tip, is naming convention of dynamic lists is very important, especially if these lists are going to live on forever. Having some way of easily identifying that these are our system lists that we're using, it has been helpful for me, and I've seen that with a lot of clients too, is just start it with something like internal or admin or something main, that starts the list, so you always can filter easily to see all of your main lists that you have. So if you create a competitors list, an employees list, there's some way for you to filter all of the lists in your database to just see those big ones that you have there. One other freebie I'll throw in there that a dynamic list can be good for is, oddly enough, an email preference center. If you want to get super complicated with your preference centers, you can, and a dynamic list can be added to a preference center. And the cool thing about it is it will only show up for people who are on the dynamic list. So they can actually see the list if they're on it, for any other person out there who is not on the dynamic list, when they view the preference center, they won't see that as a list option. So it's a really neat feature that allows you to give a little bit more customization to a preference center by leveraging dynamic lists. That's like a freebie that's not on the presentation or anything, but something that came to mind when we were talking. So dynamic lists, when you're thinking about exam and being tested on it, you're thinking about being asked to create a group of people. Again, just create a group, identify a set of records, get a count for how many records have been emailed in the last 90 days, stuff like that. We are not doing anything to them. We're basically creating the bucket of people to analyze, but we're not taking actions on them. So those are kind of the things I would look out for and to be thinking of is create lists, create a bucket, identify a set of people, but not take an action. Last but not least, certainly not least, is completion actions. I love completion actions. They are awesome. They are available on forms, form handlers, list emails, file access, custom redirect, and page action. Most often, you're going to be using them on forms and form handlers. That's where I see that the most. But these other ones are available to you as well. Some considerations for a completion action that differ from the other things we have seen thus far is that they trigger on a go forward basis. The 3 tools we've looked at already, they all trigger retroactively, meaning they will look back and get everybody who meets those criteria and either create the list or take the actions on them. With a completion action, it will not go retroactive to get everybody who has taken the action previously and do the action. It only happens from that point onward. So important thing to remember, if you forget to add a completion action to a form and 50 people fill out your form, you kind of have to do some kind of data cleanup then if you want to trigger that action to the 50 who have already filled out your form. They also don't execute in a predefined order. So just because they're listed in a certain way on the form or the asset doesn't mean they'll execute in that exact order. And then some newer things, they have a limit of 15 standard or conditional completion actions per asset, and then 6 conditional groups on an asset. So this is different. I've seen this change in the last couple years here where we're limiting it in a positive way, just so we're not overloading our completion actions. And then on file downloads and custom redirects, the adjust score action has a 24-hour throttling period so that if people are accessing the same asset multiple times in a day or clicking the link multiple times in a day, you're not like over adjusting their score too much. There are a number of other things to just be aware of with completion actions, and I linked that down below next to that key. Available actions to you, creating Salesforce tasks. So incrementing a field value, change a custom or default field value, send an autoresponder email, and notify users. So a lot of powerful actions you can take on records. Some common ones I see with forms and form handlers is sending an autoresponder is a big one. We also see a lot update the lead source, change a lifecycle value or stage value, things of that nature to move things through the funnel. So completion actions are triggering off of an action that a user takes. So if you think about that, it can be really helpful when being asked scenario-based questions. Creating an automation rule or a segmentation rule is trying to do things to query your database and do things. Completion actions trigger off of an end user action. They clicked a link. They filled out a form. They had to take an action in order for it to trigger. So helpful to think about in those terms. A newer feature to account engagement is conditional completion actions. So these trigger based on a specific value in a field, and they only trigger for records that match the value specified in that field. So this is helpful for if you have a bunch of people filling out a single form, and let's say, I think I have this example. Yes, I do. So let's say that we have a ton of people filling out a form, And we want to trigger different completion actions when they come from a UTM medium of Facebook than anything else. So you can see here in my conditional group, which is the grade box, I have the field UTM medium must equal Facebook. And when it equals Facebook, take those 3 actions: adjust their score 10, add a tag, and then notify me. So it's an easy way to take everybody coming in through a single action, like a form completion, and do different things with them. You could add them to a different Salesforce campaign. You could change a lifecycle value. You could do a whole bunch of things with them, and only take that action on subsets. You can create 6 subsets within a single asset. So keep that in mind as you're building all of this out. You do have a limit of just 6 different variations there. The other actions there will trigger on everybody as well. So helpful to know that the grade box will only trigger for people with Facebook, and then the other ones outside of that grade box will trigger for everybody. Ben, before I move on to the next section, did you have any completion action thoughts to add?
What I'm kind of curious to know whether on the exam, because it's pretty new, if they're bringing in if they've incorporated the conditional completion actions.
That's a good question.
I don't know. It's hard to say. It's pretty new, and I don't know the cadence with which they make revisions to the exam. So my recommendation would be to be kind of at least just contextually familiar with it. Like, yeah, I understand when that, but I don't know that they'll actually like drive into it. Because it's like a release or 2 old, and that's usually pretty quick turnaround to get added to an exam. But the thing about completion actions is that I had another experience recently where there was it was involved a custom redirect, and they had a completion action on the custom redirect that they were using in an email, and they were also using that custom. So there was a custom redirect that was for a URL, and the URL they were planning on using it in the email, and I was kind of talking through it with them, like in this scenario, and it was an Engagement Studio email, and as I kind of was listening, I was like, well, I don't know that this actually makes the most amount of sense, because context is potentially important, because what you do is you create a custom redirect, and that URL can be used by anybody. You can go in and grab it and throw it on social, throw it in a landing page, throw it wherever. And so your ability to determine that it actually came from that specific marketing action potentially becomes diluted. So in that scenario, it may not make sense to use a custom redirect, and with completion actions, you may just want to, in an Engagement Studio, basically select the listen step to trigger on that specific URL. So you own the actions that are coming directly from that email and triggering completion action like actions through the Engagement Studio, instead of relying on the completion action on the custom redirect. The custom redirects are great, and completion actions, in my opinion, are somewhat underappreciated because of the sheer amount you can do with them, and how many different things that can be done. How many different things that involve completion actions. You can use completion actions on, like I said, a custom redirect, form handler. The thing that people don't use as much as I think they should is the when they're uploading PDFs. If they're uploading a PDF to Pardot, you can run a completion action on the downloading that asset. And that is, if you're needing to get a full funnel view, like if you have an Engagement Studio that's driving to an email, that's driving to a landing page that is culminating in a PDF download, you can have a completion action on like a list email. You can have the completion action on the CTA that says click to link in email, and then you can have a landing page. You can have a form, or the landing page itself, if it's a Pardot landing page, a CTA that says completed landing page and have a completion action on the form, I think, in that case. And then you can have a completion action on the asset that is being served. So you would be able to know how, like, everyone who completed the entire process from being sent the email to downloading the asset. And then that then helps you in reporting. You can do, there's a lot there, and completion actions allow you to be able to tell a story more completely in terms of reporting and doing and whether it's adding to a Salesforce campaign or doing any number of things. There's a lot of actions that can be triggered from marketing assets, from marketing activity. And forms, form handlers, file access, custom redirect, page action, all these things are available, and completion actions. I don't think that conditional is available on all of these, is it?
I don't believe it is. I think it's mostly on forms.
Yeah. So they haven't rolled it out to everybody, but yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of completion actions, and in terms of the exam, when you'll be given a scenario that says they have this form that's doing this thing, and they need to be able to add them to when this thing happens, they need to be able to add them to a queue and add them to a campaign and notify a user and da-da-da-da-da. You'll hear the whole use case and be like, okay, based on everything that they're trying to do, what functionality makes the most sense based on the available answers. You'll have to be familiar with what you can do in Engagement Studio, what you can do as a completion action, what you can do as automation rule, as a segmentation rule, all these things that are requiring triggered actions. And it may be that based on what they're trying to do, it could be a mixture of a completion action on a form and an automation rule or whatever. Just being familiar with the depth and breadth of everything that is possible when asked a question, and knowing that completion actions are not retroactive, and you can change and add and remove, but it's something that will trigger whenever it happens. The one thing that I will say, this is something that came up recently, was this was kind of where this came from, where there was a custom redirect on an email, and the email showed that there was a click recorded in the activity feed on the lead. You know how, like, the engagement history lead, whatever, on the lead in contact, but it didn't trigger the actual completion action. And we were like sifting through trying to figure out why. And something that Pardot's done recently is they become a lot more proactive with sniffing out bot clicks and sniffing out those security system clicks to discern whether or not it was a human or if it was a scanning software. And so, looking at the kind of the complete picture, it became clear to me that it was that while it did record a click, and it recorded the click for the purposes of engagement history, it didn't record a click in the eyes of Pardot as an actual human. So it didn't actually trigger, it didn't actually record a click on the custom redirect, and thus did not trigger the completion action.
Yep. So it's sneaky.
It is sneaky. It's very sneaky, but it's only going to trigger when they have a good feeling that it was an actual human doing it. So even though the click might have been recorded by the engagement history, it didn't actually record as a true click in the completion in the engagement or the custom redirect, and so it's not going to trigger anything.
Makes sense. I mean, that's a good point to remember. Human interaction equals completion action. It doesn't. You have to have human doing something. They got to click the submit button on a form. They have to click a link in an email or visit a web page for page action. So that's a helpful thing to think through. It's like human interaction is necessary for completion actions to work. All right, so let's talk about some advanced settings. Rule groups allow you to create different sets of criteria with matching logic per rule group. This is really useful in dynamic lists, segmentation rules, and automation rules. Think of rule groups and match criteria as filter logic. If you're familiar with Salesforce reports, you have the filter logic 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. This is basically how you do it in Pardot. So match type, here's a helpful visual for those of us who are visual folks. You have your match type or match all is all of the rules must be true. So if each circle is a rule, every rule has to be true. And that little part in the middle, that's what's going to trigger. For a match any, you have 3 circles. Any of the rules must be true for it to work. So the entire thing, even if it's on the outlier part of a circle that doesn't overlap with anything else, it'll still run the rule. So match all, everything has to be true. Match any, think about it like or. So match all is and, match any is or. It looks like I got my slides all mixed up there, but you can see here. So here's the same screenshot from earlier. Country is United States. The overall match type of the entire filtering is set to match all. So after that first criteria, we see an and. Then we have a rule group. And within that rule group, it's match any. So it's either they filled out a form or a form handler. So if someone fills out a form or a form handler and their country is the United States, that's when this would run. Hopefully that makes sense. So breaking it down to your smallest groups is probably the easiest way to do it, and then expand out to understand really what's happening. Miscellaneous info, just to keep in mind, you can put a couple things. You can put multiple values in a field, but you don't separate them with commas. You separate them with a semicolon. So you can see right here, I have it highlighted for you. This is just like a system thing in case you wanted to do that. Also, system thing, there's a limit of 250 characters in the text field. If you need to split a big data set and you have over 250 characters and you need to have 2 different rule criteria for it, you can break it down into the 2 different blocks, and there's actually an app for that that makes it super easy. I have a link there. That's more of like an admin kind of thing. You're not going to be quizzed on the app on the exam, but this is a helpful tool that I use all the time to make my life easier. Choosing the right automation is the next section I want to run through with everybody to understand when to choose the right automation. You may have seen this with Salesforce already. It is helpful if you're newer to this or just want a really good visual to run through when thinking about what action to pick. So the first question it asks is, what is this rule based on? Is it based on criteria, meaning we're trying to build the rule criteria and see what's happening and predefined criteria, or an action? If it's an action, completion action. Actions are forms, clicking a link, opening an email, stuff like that are action-based. Going down the next one, if it's criteria, the next question is it a one-time only action? If yes, segmentation rule, right? Because it's criteria-based, but we run it the one time and that's it. Second note to that, if it's a one-time only and the action is a list, campaign, or tag, then grab your segmentation rule. Otherwise, you'll have to go down the no path as well. You can't send an email one time through a segmentation rule. What is the desired outcome? Is it just an updated list or a bucket of people, or do you want to take actions off your criteria? If we are taking actions, we are going to use an automation rule. And last but not least, if it's an updated list and you're wanting to just create a bucket of people, you would leverage your dynamic list to do that. This is by far the most helpful way of thinking through all of your options and trying to figure out which one is the right one for your scenario. So if you're presented a scenario during an exam, if you have this memorized, you can mentally go through all of the steps and then determine what option is likely the right fit for your scenario. And here's a helpful chart. Thinking about, is something retroactive? You have your yes, yes, yes for automation rule, segmentation, and rule and dynamic list. Running continuously in the background, you can see I have listed out a couple of things in a helpful chart to help you kind of think through some of those things. So most of these things have check marks, but there's a couple outliers in each column just to be aware of. in the interest of time, I'm going to move to the next section and put it all together for a couple of scenario-based thoughts. So when designing complex automations, this is the mental process I go through often. Really seek to understand and document for a real-world scenario. Document the problem that you're trying to solve for the exam. Seek to understand. Really try to understand what they're getting at. Spend time asking questions if you're in a real-world scenario. Don't assume anything. Important for the exam too. Don't assume you know the answer after reading 2 sentences. Read the full explanation and then you'll find your answer. And then just consider different scenarios and outcomes. Try and think through, am I missing anything? Are there maybe different ways that this could go? And just ask questions from there. So step number 1, understand and document. Step 2, document all of it. So this is a real world scenario, but take the time to document things like the challenge you're solving, put it to words, who's going to be involved in the project, are there any objectives or goals you need to be aware of, and then even document any potential roadblocks you may hit as you're trying to design a solution here. Map out a proposed solution. So after you've gone through the first 2 steps, you should have a good idea of what the challenge is and what your end state should be. And now is where you can start thinking of how do we get from A to B. So what are all the steps along the way to get us from point A to point B? So think through a couple ways of solving your challenge. Remember, like I said, first thought does not always equal the best thought. Document your first thought. Sometimes it is the best, but come up with a couple other options and try to think of different ways to approach a workflow to make it even more optimized. You may find that your first thought was 3 or 4 steps too complicated, and that by thinking through it a little bit more, you can actually streamline your approach a lot more and come up with a solution that's even better and more scalable in the long run. And my favorite thing is to use like a visual chart to outline what I'm doing so that I can explain it easier to people. And my future self, 6 months down the road, knows what I was doing because it's visually mapped out for me. So Lucid Chart's a good one for that. I've even done it in just a plain presentation before, like a PowerPoint or a Google Slides presentation, just a rough outline of what we're doing with the data and what tools it's touching. Decide on your solution. So review it with stakeholders, review it with people who are involved in your project, who have a say in what's going on. Review whatever you're trying to do, review it with them, make sure they understand it. Give them the opportunity to ask any questions that they may have and point out any gaps in a solution, and then make the tweaks to your proposal and get sign off from your stakeholders on a project. Finally, implement and test it. So after you have sign off, implement what you have listed out and then test it thoroughly. Make sure you do as much testing as you can think of and try and spend time debugging and testing. That way you find all of the potential gaps early and you don't come back months down the road and realize, oops, we missed a subset of records. So testing is a overlooked but needed step. So make sure you do that. Launch it. Once it's tested and good, push it live to the world, share what you're doing in your org. And then a forgotten step that I often tell people is monitor it. Don't just launch it and go, okay, it's done. I don't have to look at the automation anymore. That's how you get into the scenario that I described earlier with an automation role that was running on 30,000 prospects a day. Keep an eye on what's happening. Make sure it's not doing that. So keep a close eye on it in the early stages. And then as you're confident that it's working, you can check in a little less often, but still check in and then make adjustments along the way. So needed step that is overlooked, but very important. So that's just like an overview of how to design a complex automation. I would say this applies to like building lead nurturing strategies too, really understanding what you're trying to do and then documenting along the way of all the things that you could think of that will help make your project a success. So hopefully that helps. I know we have 2 minutes left, so Ben, I'll turn it over to you for any like final thoughts or things.
No, I don't mean that's basically. I mean, I think you covered it pretty thoroughly. The overarching kind of concept to remember to take home is is that automations are the backbone of the platform, much like any marketing automation platform. And there's a uniqueness to Pardot / account engagement in that it's in its level of integration with Salesforce. And so when you're looking at the exam and you're seeing them reference, like, because they'll probably throw things at you like, there's an opportunity, the account owner has an opportunity and they want to be able to send email marketing to they need to be able to build a list that also does it, and they'll throw all kinds of random nonsense at you. Basically just being comfortable and familiar with the different kinds of automations that are out there and what does what, how things work, what the limits are on some of them, and being comfortable with kind of sussing out the best path forward that meets or satisfies the requirement. If you have a dev org, I mean, just be familiar and comfortable with what Engagement Studio is, how it's different from automation rules versus completion actions versus segmentation rules versus whatever. I mean, there's a lot out there, and the automation piece here, I think has a weighted value of 17%. So it's not nothing. It's definitely, the questions that you get are gonna meaningfully impact your score at the end of the day. So if you are feeling a little unsure about the automations piece of it, I would just, if you have the ability to get access to spend time in an org, just do what you can, try and make some make sense of what the automations do and don't do, and consider use cases. If you're in a role today where you get these kind of use cases brought up to you, consider that they'll probably be thinking, and the people who wrote the exam are kind of thinking with that in mind, of what are business problems that occur that a Pardot / account engagement admin or consultant in this case would be asked to tackle and to deal with. There's a lot of things come up that you're going to need to be able to say, we should create an automation rule for this, and we should not create an engagement studio because XYZ, or we should create a segmentation rule because segmentation rules do this specific thing that meets this criteria and the others don't. So just make sure that you're aware of what they do and don't do, and remember that you don't have to answer the questions right away on the exam. You can flag them and come back to them. That's what I recommend. Is if you look at the question, and in the first 5 to 7 seconds, it doesn't immediately come to you, which is the right answer, flag it. Because the goal, this is just my philosophy, because you want to use all the time that's available to you, and you want to get through the answers that you have a high level of confidence in first. So you're not stressing and you're like, because you're agonizing over the 2 minutes, 3 minutes on a single question, when you still got another 30 to do, to just go through the ones that you know quickly, and the ones you don't, flag it and come back later. So with that, I think we can wrap it up. Thanks so much, Allie, for completing this course, this series, and this will be added to the Pardot Geeks blog with this additional session, and it'll be up on YouTube. So yeah, thank you so much. This has been great. Thank you for taking the time to share your expertise, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks so much. All right, bye everybody.
Bye.